In this video, we're going to talk about F-I-R-E, FIRE. But of course, for us, that is an acronym that stands for something, and it stands for financial independence, and retire early. Sometimes people will use the entire acronym FIRE, which of course is the first letter of each of these words. But oftentimes people will just use these first two letters when they're referring to this concept of achieving financial independence or retiring early. For our purposes, we're not going to really spend a lot of time on retiring early. And the reason that is because sometimes there's a misconception when we talk about reaching financial independence. And that misconception is that you have to stop working. You have to stop working. And some people will say, I love my job and there's no reason for me, or I don't have any desire to actually stop working. So we want to make the distinction between retiring, which often again refers, people think of stopping work, to what we're going to refer to as stopping necessary or required work. Okay, required work. So when we talk about financial independence, what we mean is that you no longer have to work for your living. Okay, let's give a little more room here. So exactly how are we going to do this, right? So how is the normal person going to be able to do this? Well, you could say that we could win the lottery, right? We could have the next big startup. You're the next Facebook, you're the next Snapchat, whatever the case may be. Maybe you think we're talking about, some kind of inheritance, right? But for this series of videos and this entire channel, we're not talking about any of this stuff. So what is the way to do this? How can we actually retire early without any of these kind of crazy scenarios of the lottery or startup, etc.? Well, there's nothing particularly fancy about it. It is just saving more than spending. Saving more than you spend. But if you think about it and someone said, how much exactly do you need for retirement, to reach financial independence? So how much do you need, right? So again, we're talking about stopping the need for necessary work, such that the money that you saved and the interest that you're earning on those savings and investments are sufficient enough for you to live. Okay. Well, many people might think it's $1 million, $5 million, $10 million. Doesn't really matter what you might think it is. The fact is that for the most part, people don't know. So if you say how much, the answer is I don't know. Okay, so we're going to introduce a couple of simple mathematical concepts to let you know exactly what that number is, and then we'll have future videos on how exactly do we maximize savings, minimize spending without sacrificing quality of life. That's going to be a big fundamental concept, that as we're doing this, we're not actually living on ramen noodles. We are living a great life, but we're still maximizing savings while we are minimizing our spending. So if you look at how much, the simple starting point is going to be 25 times your expenses, and this is annual. Let's see here. Let me get this back on the screen so you can actually read what I'm writing. So this is annual expenses. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, implicit in this is that you know what those expenses are, and we'll cover different ways on exactly how you can measure that. But I will say quickly that 25 is a range. You could have less than that, and you can have more than that. Typically people will say, or you might think of it as a range between 22x to 28x, right? I'm choosing 25, kind of a nice point in the middle to start at as, an entry point. So if we look at this and we say, well, okay, what does that actually mean? Well, if you knew what your annual expenses were, we'll have to track that and say that those annual expenses were $30,000. For many people, you might start out hearing that number and say that's way too much. Some people might think that's way too little. It all depends on the particular situation of the person. I could tell you, as a family of 4, it's actually a very close number. So if we say 30,000 is annual expenses, again, not income, actual expenditures, and we're going to multiply that by 25, well, 30,000 multiplied by 25 gives us the number of 750,000. Maybe that seems like a lot. Maybe that seems like not so much to you. The point of this introductory video is that now it is no longer a question. It's no longer a question mark to you. You know what the number is that you need to hit in order to stop having to work for your living. And of course, you have to put in your own numbers here. If your number is 40,000, or if you think 25 is too little and you want to focus on or index on the 28, right? Then the number will be different. The input for both of those will be different. But the point is, the mystery is gone, and now you know what the bullseye is. What are you shooting for? So without getting into a ton of details in this first video, do want to introduce this idea of where this 25 is coming from. And often people will either say 25 times your expenses, or they will say 4%. 4%. Why do they say 4%? Well, there's a lot of reasons behind where that number comes from, which we'll get into. But in terms of the math here, if you multiply 750,000 by 4, if you multiply 750,000 by 4%, you will actually get $30,000, which of course is this same number up here. This 4% is often referred to as a SWR, which is safe withdrawal rate. All that means is that I think if I have investments that are $750,000, and every year those investments are at least earning me 4%, and I know I'm oversimplifying here, but as an introduction, if those 750,000 is at least earning 4% every year, and we know that 4% equals $30,000, and my annual expenses are also $30,000, then I will never have less than I need. We'll get into the math in future videos. To wrap this one up, let's talk about a couple of action items, right? This isn't just a video series, or it's not intended to be just a video series that you watch for, education without action. We want action. We want everyone, including ourselves, to reach this number, at least in our example, this $750,000, this financial independence number, as quickly as possible. So what could be a couple of action items for us? Okay, what do you think your annual expenses are? So this isn't we'll get into this. This isn't a detailed calculation of what those expenses are. This is just, what do you think they are? Do you think it's 20,000, 50,000? What do you think those expenses are? And if that's what those annual expenses are, what is your phi number? What is your phi number? So again, to calculate that, you're going to take basically your annual expenses, and you're going to multiply that times 22 to 25 or 28 if you think you need a lot more. For simplicity's sake, I say start out like we did in this example with the number 25. So if you multiply your annual expenses by 25, you will reach this phi number. And that again is the bullseye, the target needed in order to stop, go all the way back to the top here, stop, all the way to the top, stop necessary work.